Hello and welcome to episode 9 of the Warwick Podcastle. In this episode we'll be highlighting 5 more of our favourite documents from the Greville family of Warwick Castle collection here at Warwickshire County Record Office. We'll be starting this episode with senior archivist Rob, who is taking us back to the turn of the 17th century with his favourite documents, which, given that Warwickshire is a landlocked county, have a surprising nautical theme.
My favourite series of documents in the Warwick Castle collection relates to 5 account books, which refer to the maintenance and provisioning of Queen Elizabeth's fleet. So, as they relate to ships and the sea, why are they part of the Warwick Castle archive? Well, it is because of this man, Fulk Greville, Lord Brooke. Now, the Grevilles were a long-established Warwickshire family, and their main seat was Beauchamp Court near Ulster. Fulk Greville was bright. He attended Cambridge University and eventually became a Member of Parliament. He found favour in the Elizabethan court, where he was admired for his administrative skills. He was appointed to the Principality of Wales, and eventually he was appointed to several important posts, including Chancellor of the Exchequer. But before that, he was Treasurer of the Navy between 1599 and 1603, and then Rear Admiral. He was a man of letters, a poet and playwright, but he also had some military experience in the French Wars of Religion, and we see here in the first volume that he is recorded as captain of the Triumph. And it says here that he's serving Her Majesty as captain of Her Highness' ship, the Triumph, for 31 days more, for wages for a master and the rest of the ship's company serving partly in harbour for 21 days, and then at sea for a month, as by a sea book containing every man's name, time and wage examined, and for the conduct in discharge of the said company from Chatham to sundry places, total £420, 5 shillings and 3pence. So I wonder if the sea book mentioned is this very book or not. I don't know. That is the only time that I can find him recorded in one of the volumes as a sea captain. For the most part, he is an administrator. The volumes are grand. The covers are possibly made of vellum, which is calfskin, with this rather Gothic-y hand on the cover proclaiming the account of Fulk Greville, Esquire, Treasurer of the Queen's Majesty's Marine Causes, as well as ordinary as extraordinary. So what does this mean? The phrase ordinary refers to keeping warships in storage during peacetime, or basically out of active service. And so sea causes extraordinary is when it is in a state of readiness, which was the case with the Triumph. Perhaps Fulk Greville was ready for a further attempted Spanish invasion. This was a tremendously important role at this time. There had been 3 attempted armadas, the last one only the previous year, and so keeping the fleet shipshape was a huge responsibility. The rest of the volumes are made up of a good quality paper that would have been expensive at the time, and a secretary hand, which is quite readable once you get your eye in. What does each volume contain? Well, a large part of each volume is taken up with recording standing crews, that is, the crew on duty whilst the vessels are in ordinary. This page shows the Triumph again, which was the largest ship built in the reign of Elizabeth, a 60-gun galleon drafted in as a warship when required. This is from the 1600 volume, so a year later than the previous one. It is located in Chatham in Kent at this time, which was Britain's largest and most important dock. Can you imagine the scene with these huge vessels all lined up? It must have looked very impressive because there are a whole series of ships mentioned. It lists the crew of the Triumph, and it begins with John Austin, who is the master mariner, who is being paid £6, 10 shillings for 13 weeks' work, which according to the National Archives currency converter would be worth nearly £900 now. But at the time, you could buy 3 cows with it, so not to be sniffed at. Then you've got Richard Middleton, who's the boatswain, at 54 shillings for 13 weeks. The boatswain, that's the ship's officer in charge of equipment and the crew. Then it mentions a Roland Searles, who's the purser, 43 shillings and fourpence. John Rowley, the cook. Henry Matchfield, the boat's boy. Edward Parker, the master gunner, and so on and so on. So the total for the crew for 13 weeks is recorded as £56, 6 shillings and 5pence. The next image features references to the Ark, or the Ark Royal. Now, a lot of these names are reused, so many are very familiar names to us, but they're not necessarily referring to the most famous version of the ship. This volume also includes the Victory, the Defiance, the Foresight, the Warspite, and many, many other ships. It is quite easy, actually, to surf the net and find information about these vessels, their military service, and what happened to them, which is really interesting, I find. In this particular case, the Ark remained in service until 1636, when it was sunk in the River Medway by being struck by her own anchor. The next image shows the Deptford Ordinary, which was home to the Royal Dockyards. We see in this section the recruitment of tradesmen to work on the ships: carpenters, sawyers, joiners, bricklayers, tilers and labourers, to quote, repairing and new tiling of Her Majesty's great house and storehouses there, making and chimneying the said house, and repairing other useful places there. So not just ships being repaired, elsewhere I've seen references to repairs to floodgates at Deptford and wharfs at Woolwich. So for anyone interested in maritime history, this is a tremendous resource, and perhaps one of the more surprising discoveries in the Warwick Castle archive.
Next, we're jumping forward to the 20th century with archivist Sharon, who is taking us below stairs with her favourite document.
Despite my having been familiar with the Greville family archive for the past 8 years, I've only recently come across what I think is my favourite document in the collection. It's a letter from 1902, tucked into the boxes and boxes of servants' wage sheets that appear throughout the collection. Lily Baxter is a kitchen maid at the Greville's Eastern Lodge estate in Essex, and she's written to the Earl of Warwick's agent, Mr. Godfrey Peyton, querying a stoppage from her wages. It's an unremarkable document written on scraps of paper, but I think it's inspiring. So to set the scene, we have a schedule of payments showing Lily's earnings for 7 weeks in November and December 1901, plus her board wages and expenses. The final entry is 10 shillings for a rail fare back to London from Euston, with a note saying, "Leaving at her ladyship's wish." The line is crossed through, and on the 5th of January, Lily writes her letter full of rage and indignation. "I cannot understand why 10 shillings was stopped from my fare," she says. "I have always had my fare paid both ways when on a job, wherever I have been." Lily says she'd been engaged to go to Euston permanently, but a week before she was due to start, she was told her contract would end just after 7 weeks, because the chef was bringing in her own kitchen maid. This maybe explains why she was leaving at her ladyship's wish. Lily concludes, "I have been out of a situation ever since, and have had to lie in lodgings, so I wish to claim my board wages, which are always due when a person has had to go before their engagement is finished, for no bad reason." She encloses a separate sheet detailing exactly what she thinks is due to her: £3 and 2 shillings in board wages, in addition to the rail fare. I think the reason I find this inspiring is that Lily is a domestic servant, exactly as I would probably have been at the time, and she has plainly been treated badly by the Countess of Warwick and the cook. But she's not prepared to accept her lot, and her letter to the agent is angry but polite, articulate and clear. She would have been around 27 years old at the time she wrote the letter, and had already worked for the Grevilles as a kitchen maid at Warwick Castle. And I'm not a historian, so perhaps it was commonplace at the time, but I was surprised and delighted by Lily's attitude and eloquence. Perhaps it was this that caused the chef to replace her, and even though her options in life would have been limited at this time, I hope she went on fighting her corner and holding her betters, in inverted commas, to account.
Staying in the 20th century now, our Warwickshire web editor Ben is going to tell us about his favourite document.
Fire and Warwick often seem to go hand in hand. Naturally, there's the Great Fire of Warwick, And also Warwick Castle itself has been subject to a number of extreme incidents, the most famous of which was in 1871, where a disastrous fire destroyed a lot of the castle and required it to be rebuilt, much of the money raised by public subscription. To other extremes in recent times, in 1928, the barking of a bulldog enabled people to discover a fire and restrict damage to just to a door. However, on Friday 18th of December 1903, a fire broke out at Warwick Castle Estate Office in Drury Street and did a considerable amount of damage. The fire was confined to the ground floor, but the whole of the office furniture and a quantity of account books and papers were destroyed. Now, the outbreak was discovered shortly after 7 o'clock and was suppressed by the local fire brigade. Sometimes it's not the content of a document that can be interesting or fascinating, but the document itself. What's great about Warwickshire County Record Office is that you can touch the documents, you can connect quite literally to history, you can make it real, and this document is a prime example of that. It's one of the surviving account books from the estate office. It's from 1902, just before the fire, and you have to be very careful when handling it because the edges are particularly charred and can come away as you touch it. It really is giving you a connection to that time. Not only that, but a lot of the pages within the documents are blurred out because, as said, the fire brigade suppressed it. It's been doused in water. But despite that, it survives. The content itself doesn't particularly interest me that much. I'm not that interested in mortgage debentures, but it gives a connection to that time period, to that point, and that's something that you don't get very often. The fire itself has obviously destroyed some documents that we can't look at anymore, but this survives, this is preserved. And thanks to the work of the County Record Office, it can be preserved for longer into the future as well. But handle it with care. Feel that time. Imagine both the panic and the efforts to save it. It may not be the famous fire at Warwick Castle, but nonetheless, it's a fire that offers an insight into the time and into the good fortune that we have so many documents still preserved within the castle itself.
The next document is brought to us by Richard, the Collections and Development Manager, who is taking us all the way back to the 12th century.
All records are important and tell us something, but there's no denying the excitement, and for a split second the breathtaking experience of seeing a significantly older document. The fact less documents survive the further back we go does give older documents a certain cachet. This excitement is part of the reason I chose this conveyance from 1119, or so we thought. Since the 1970s, if people ask what is our oldest document, and they often do, we'd say this one. It's a conveyance from Henry, Earl of Warwick, which for the good of himself, Margaret his wife, and all his ancestors, sees him grant the church of Compton Murdoch to the church of St Mary in Warwick. Circa 1119. Seemed a safe bet when looking at the witnesses, and particularly as Henry died in 1119. This was supported by the seal of Henry, Earl of Warwick. 1119 it was. Well, it was until November 2015, when we were made aware that David Crouch had looked at this document, and due to the handwriting, dated approximately 50 years later than 1119. Did this leave the handwriting indicating one date, and the seal indicating another? Fortunately it didn't, as David stated it's the seal of a later Earl, Henry's grandson William. Thanks to David's expertise, we're confident the charter is created after 1119. This leads us to question why would this be? Conspiracy theorists may latch onto it being a forgery designed to mislead, but we don't believe this to be the case. We suspect it's one of two less nefarious reasons. It could simply be a replacement as the original got mislaid or badly damaged. It could also be that the conveyance took place with a ceremony rather than a deed, which we know happened, and then in time it was felt pertinent to record it in a deed. It could be something entirely different, but we feel a replacement or a recording of an earlier event the most likely reason, for the date of the event being one and the date the record was created being another. We look for archives, both the records and the repositories, to provide us with answers, and the fact that they sometimes provide questions is exciting, and that for me is the thing I love most about this deed.
Finally, I'm going to talk about my favourite document, which gives us a rare insight into 18th century family life. My favourite document is this book of physical receipts. Now, when I say receipts, I don't mean the little bits of paper showing that we've paid for something, but rather what we today would call recipes, so we can think of this book as a recipe book. But again, it's not quite like the recipe books we have today. In the 16th to 19th centuries, cookery and medicine were closely related disciplines, and housewives or their servants would typically be the ones responsible for not just preparing the meals, but also treating illnesses. So what we have here is actually a book full of medicinal remedies for a variety of ailments. The word receipt comes from the Latin for to take or to receive, and was often abbreviated to a capital R with an X through it, which is a symbol still used in pharmacies today. We can even see an example of this symbol on this remedy to cure deafness, which involved pouring warm tar water into the affected ear and making sure to keep it in with a small piece of black wool. These receipts would have come from a variety of places and would have been collected by the book's owner over a number of years. The owner of this sort of book typically would have been the head of a household. Although some receipt books were created by men, they were most often compiled by women. The recipes consisted of products commonly found in kitchens of the day, and they were usually food-based, although you probably wouldn't want to eat some of them. The recipes themselves provide an insight into the lifestyle of the Greville family in the 18th century. Before we began this cataloguing project, this particular receipt book had never been attributed to a particular person, but now we've had a chance to delve a bit deeper into this collection, we've managed to cross-reference the handwriting and discover who was gathering and writing the recipes down. The handwriting appears to match that of Elizabeth, the first Greville Countess of Warwick, which we can see from this pedigree that she wrote showing her noble lineage. Elizabeth was born a Hamilton, and she was the granddaughter of the Duke of Hamilton. When Elizabeth married Francis Greville in 1742, he only held the title of Baron Brooke, but she helped him to elevate the family status, and just 4 years later in 1746 he was granted the title Earl Brooke. Although the Greville family had owned Warwick Castle for 142 years at this point, the title of Earl of Warwick was divorced from the castle and the town, instead being held by the Rich family. When Edward Rich, 8th Earl of Warwick, died in 1759, he left behind only a daughter, so with the lack of a male heir, the title became extinct. Seizing the opportunity, Francis Greville petitioned the King, George II, for the title and managed to reunite the title of Earl of Warwick with the castle. So to return to Elizabeth's receipt book, we can see a range of different remedies, such as a cure for inflammation of the eyes, a cure for the ague, and a mixture to help cure a burn. Treatments for the cure of bites from mad dogs feature heavily, so that must have been something that she was particularly concerned about. There is even a prescription created for her by a Mr. Bliss, which she took in April 1785, containing the rind of a Seville orange, chamomile flowers, cloves, Hexam's tincture of bark, and elixir of vitriol, which was a mixture of alcohol and sulphuric acid. Elizabeth hasn't noted what this is a treatment for, but elixir of vitriol was used as a treatment for scurvy. The book is well organised, with the last few pages dedicated to an index so she could find the receipts she needed to quickly if necessary. The very last page is dedicated to some notes on her daughter Anne's veins, so that any doctors would know where she could be bled safely if it was needed when they travelled to France. Anne was Elizabeth's youngest child, born just 2 weeks before the end of her and Francis' marriage. In the years leading up to Anne's birth, Elizabeth had grown close to General Robert Clark, a Scottish officer who had often visited Warwick Castle in the 1750s. I wonder if the absence of similar notes about Anne's siblings is significant. Could there have been a genetic issue that meant that not all of her veins could be bled safely? Perhaps a genetic issue that wouldn't have been shared with her brothers and sisters if she had a different father. Unfortunately, this is something that we will never know for sure, but we do know that Anne died young in 1783, aged only 23. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Warwick Podcastle. We hope you've enjoyed learning more about some of our favourite documents from the Greville family of Warwick Castle collection. Do you have a favourite document from the Greville archive? Let us know in the comments below. With over 1,000 boxes of material, there are always plenty more treasures to be found.